The afternoon sun painted warm stripes across the worn linoleum floors of Oak Haven Middle School. It was mid-October in quiet Willow Creek, Montana, and the classrooms buzzed with the typical sounds of early adolescence: hushed gossip, the rhythmic tapping of pencils, and the occasional stifled giggle. Room 204 was no different. The air hummed with the restless energy of 25 seventh graders settling in for their math class. Near the back, by a window overlooking a wind-swept field, sat Ethan Bell, a lanky boy with a mop of unruly brown hair. At 13, Ethan possessed a quiet demeanor that allowed him to blend seamlessly into the background. His eyes, the color of faded denim, held a sharp intelligence, but they often seemed to be focused on something beyond the confines of the classroom. As he placed his well-worn notebook on the desk, his posture was relaxed, almost to the point of being slumped. One arm rested casually on the desk, the other propped his chin, as if holding his gaze fixed on the world outside. The scene beyond the window, a lone hawk circling overhead, the swaying golden grasses, the distant snow-capped peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, seemed to hold a far greater allure than the bustling classroom around him. Ethan wasn't deliberately trying to be inattentive. His mind was simply wired differently, processing information at a speed that often left him impatient with the slower pace of classroom instruction. Numbers and equations fascinated him, but the rote memorization and repetitive drills of his math class felt stifling, uninspiring. Instead of raising his hand or seeking extra challenges, he allowed his thoughts to wander, finding solace in the steady rhythm of the natural world. His notebook, though filled with the required assignments, also contained hidden treasures, margins crammed with complex equations and innovative solutions he'd scribbled during his free time. These were puzzles he set for himself, intellectual challenges that kept his sharp mind engaged. He found a particular fascination with prime numbers, their unpredictable distribution across the number line a source of endless curiosity. He dreamt of unlocking their secrets, of finding patterns where others saw only randomness. At the front of the room, Mrs. Eleanor Harding, a teacher with 20 years of experience, stood with her arms crossed, observing her students as they settled in. A no-nonsense educator with a kind heart, Mrs. Harding was known for her unwavering dedication and high expectations. Her sensible skirt suit and neatly coiffed silver hair only added to her air of quiet authority. She believed in fostering a supportive learning environment, but she also knew that some students needed a gentle nudge to unlock their full potential. Today, however, her patience was being tested. The results of the recent algebra quiz lay in a disheartening pile on her desk. While a few students had demonstrated a solid understanding of the material, the majority had struggled, making careless errors and failing to grasp fundamental concepts. Mrs. Harding refused to accept mediocrity, and the sight of so many low scores left her wondering if her students were truly committed to their studies. She silently hoped they were not just relying on her to spoon-feed them the answers. She picked up the stack of papers and began calling names, returning the quizzes with brief, personalized comments. "Good effort, Sarah," she'd say to one. "Needs more focus, Michael," she'd advise another. When she reached Ethan's desk, she paused for a moment, her gaze softening slightly. His quiz sat at the top of the stack, adorned with a large, perfect score, circled in bright red. It wasn't the first time Ethan had aced a test, but his apparent lack of engagement in class frustrated her. Handing him the paper, she offered no comment, her lips pressed into a thin, almost imperceptible line. She then turned back to the front of the room, her brow furrowed in thought. "All right, listen up, everyone." Mrs. Harding's voice cut through the remaining chatter, silencing the room. She placed the stack of quizzes on her desk and leaned against it, her keen eyes scanning the rows of students. "Most of you did adequately," she began, her tone suggesting otherwise. "But far too many of you are still struggling with concepts we've been covering for weeks." Ethan, barely listening, rested his chin on his hand, his gaze once again drawn to the window. The whisper of wind through the golden grass seemed far more engaging than Ms. Harding's critique. He didn't notice her sharp eyes flicker in his direction as she continued. "This is fundamental algebra, people," Ms. Harding said, her voice rising slightly. "You'll need to master this if you want to succeed in higher-level math, in college, or even in many career paths." She paused, her gaze lingering on Ethan's distant expression. A flicker of impatience crossed her face. "Ethan Bell," she called out sharply, her voice shattering the quiet. Ethan jolted upright, his hand slipping from his chin, his eyes widening in surprise. His classmates turned to look at him, their expressions a mixture of amusement and curiosity. A wave of heat rushed to his cheeks. "Yes, Mrs. Harding?" he stammered, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Harding narrowed her eyes. "You seem exceptionally interested in the scenery outside," she said, nodding towards the window. "Care to share what's so captivating?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond but quickly clamped it shut, unsure of what to say. The room filled with a few muffled chuckles, but Mrs. Harding wasn't smiling. "Let's see if you've been paying attention," she continued, her tone pointed. "Come up here!" The room fell silent as Ethan stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. His classmates watched with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. "Oh, he's in trouble now," one student muttered under his breath. "He never says anything," another added, stifling a snicker. Ethan swallowed hard, his palms sweating. He walked towards the front of the room. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, each step seeming to lengthen the distance to the whiteboard. Mrs. Harding stood by the board, marker in hand, her expression unreadable. "Let's see how much you've truly absorbed," she said, writing an equation on the board with deliberate strokes. It was a complex problem, far beyond the scope of the current curriculum, but not beyond the capabilities of someone with Ethan's hidden talent. She then stepped back, holding the marker out to him. "Go ahead," she challenged. "Show us what you've got." Ethan took the marker, the cool plastic pressing into his damp hand. He stared at the equation for a moment, his mind racing. The whispers and suppressed laughter behind him only amplified the pressure. His heart pounded in his chest. For a fleeting moment, he considered handing the marker back and retreating to the safety of his anonymity. But something stopped him. A small voice inside reminding him of the countless hours he had spent immersed in similar problems. The quiet satisfaction he found in their intricate solutions. This wasn't just about Ms. Harding or his classmates. It was about him and what he knew he could do. Ethan took a deep breath, raised the marker to the board, and began to write. The classroom seemed to shrink as Ethan stood before the whiteboard, the marker feeling heavier with each passing second. His eyes danced over the equation, a formidable tangle of variables, exponents, and nested parentheses. This was no ordinary 7th grade problem. It was a carefully constructed challenge designed to expose his supposed inattentiveness. Behind him, the class murmured, their hushed voices laced with doubt and amusement. "No way he's solving that," a boy whispered, his voice dripping with skepticism. "He probably doesn't even know where to start," another added, a ripple of laughter following his words. Ethan's shoulders tensed, but he refused to turn around. He focused on the equation, letting the familiar symbols draw him in, shutting out the noise and the negativity. His heart was still pounding, but beneath the anxiety, a spark of determination ignited. He could solve this. He just needed to concentrate. At her desk, Mrs. Harding watched, her expression inscrutable. To her, this was more than just a test of Ethan's mathematical abilities. It was a test of his focus, his resilience, and his willingness to challenge himself. She had always been intrigued by Ethan's quiet nature, sensing a hidden potential that he seemed unwilling to unleash. Now, she was about to find out what he was truly capable of. "Well, Ethan," she said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the silence. "We're waiting." Ethan inhaled deeply and lifted the marker. Slowly, deliberately, he began to write. His first strokes were tentative, testing the waters, but as he moved from one step to the next, his hand grew steadier, more confident. He started by carefully distributing the negative sign within the parentheses, then combined like terms, simplifying the equation bit by bit. At first, the class remained largely unmoved. Some students had expected him to crumble under the pressure, to freeze or give up entirely. They were surprised when he actually began to work through the problem. As the numbers and symbols on the board began to coalesce, forming a coherent solution, a ripple of murmurs spread through the room. "Wait, is he actually doing it?" A girl in the second row whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Looks like it," her friend replied, leaning forward to get a better view. Ethan's mind moved quickly, dissecting the equation into smaller, manageable pieces. He worked methodically, isolating variables, simplifying fractions, and eliminating unnecessary steps. His hand moved faster now, the squeak of the marker against the board filling the expectant silence. He wasn't just solving the problem, he was deconstructing it, exposing its underlying logic, revealing the elegant simplicity hidden beneath its complex facade. The room grew quieter as more students realized what was happening. The whispers ceased, replaced by wide-eyed stares of astonishment. Even the boy who had scoffed earlier was now leaning forward, his mouth slightly agape, his initial skepticism replaced by a grudging respect. Behind Ethan, Mrs. Harding's expression underwent a subtle transformation. She had expected him to struggle, perhaps even fail spectacularly, but as she watched his solution unfold with remarkable clarity and precision, she felt a growing sense of awe. His steps were logical, his calculations accurate, and his understanding of the underlying principles was undeniable. She stepped closer to the board, her keen eyes scrutinizing each line of his work, her lips moving silently as she verified his steps. Ethan paused briefly, double-checking his work, ensuring that he hadn't made any careless errors. He could feel the intense scrutiny of the class, but instead of letting it paralyze him, he used it as fuel, channeling the pressure into focus and precision. He wrote the last few numbers, circled the final answer, and capped the marker with a satisfying click. Stepping back, he turned to face the room, his heart pounding in his chest, but his expression remarkably calm. The whiteboard behind him was filled with neat lines of equations, each step building upon the last, leading to the correct solution. For a moment, no one spoke. The room was so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed deafening. Ethan scanned the room, catching glimpses of wide eyes and slack jaws. Even the students who usually ignored him now looked at him with something bordering on reverence. Mrs. Harding stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She studied the board closely, her finger tracing each line of Ethan's solution, her brow furrowed slightly at one point before smoothing out again. Finally, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable, a complex mix of surprise, admiration, and perhaps a touch of regret. "This is correct," she said, her voice quieter than usual, almost reverent. A ripple of disbelief washed over the class, followed by a few tentative claps. The applause grew louder, filling the room as more students joined in, their initial skepticism replaced by genuine appreciation. Ethan stood there, unsure of how to react. His cheeks burned, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment, it was from something new, something unfamiliar: pride. As the clapping subsided, Mrs. Harding addressed the class. "What you just witnessed wasn't a fluke, or a lucky guess," she said, gesturing to the board. "This is the result of deep understanding, of a mind that truly grasps the underlying principles." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. Ethan didn't just solve this problem. He deconstructed it, revealing its inner workings. He made a complex equation seem almost effortless. That's true mastery. Her words hung in the air, and for once Ethan didn't feel the urge to shrink back into his seat, to disappear into the background. Instead, he stood a little taller, his hands loosely at his sides, allowing himself to bask in the glow of recognition. "Ethan," Mrs. Harding continued, her tone softer now, more encouraging than demanding, "why haven't you spoken up before? If you possess this level of understanding, why do you sit in the back, so quiet, so seemingly disengaged?" Ethan hesitated, glancing down at his worn sneakers. He didn't know how to articulate the complex emotions that had kept him silent for so long. How could he explain the fear of standing out, the comfort of remaining invisible, the nagging feeling that his talents were somehow out of place? After a moment, he simply shrugged. I didn't think anyone noticed," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Harding's expression softened, her eyes filled with a newfound understanding. "Well, Ethan," she said gently, "it's time for that to change." The applause still echoed in Ethan's ears as he returned to his seat. The weight of the moment settled over him, not as a burden, but as a warm, comforting blanket. His classmates, still processing what they had witnessed, exchanged hushed whispers and occasional glances in his direction. Ethan felt their eyes on him, but this time they weren't filled with ridicule or indifference. They were wide with curiosity, respect, and perhaps even a touch of envy. Mrs. Harding remained at the front of the room, her hands clasped together as if in deep contemplation. She wasn't a teacher who readily dispensed praise or sought to be popular. She believed in challenging her students, pushing them to reach their full potential. But Ethan's performance had shaken her assumptions, not just about him, but about her own teaching methods. It had reminded her of the importance of looking beyond outward appearances, of recognizing the hidden talents that often lie dormant beneath a veil of quietness. "Class," she said, raising her voice to silence the lingering murmurs, "what you saw today is a powerful reminder that everyone in this room possesses unique potential." Ethan demonstrated that potential in a remarkable way. He didn't just solve a complex equation, he showed us what it looks like to approach a challenge with clarity, focus, and unwavering determination. Ethan sat at his desk, still clutching his notebook, his heart finally beginning to slow. But his thoughts raced, filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He hadn't planned for this moment, hadn't sought the spotlight. Solving equations in the margins of his notebook had always been a private escape, something he did for himself, not for recognition. But now, for the first time, people were noticing him, acknowledging his abilities, and it felt both exhilarating and profoundly unsettling. A girl sitting a row ahead of him turned around, her eyes wide with genuine curiosity. "How did you do that?" she asked, her voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. Ethan hesitated, his usual instinct to deflect attention battling with a newfound sense of self-assurance. I just worked through it," he said modestly, his voice still quiet but more confident than before. Another student chimed in. "That was insane. Are you, like, a math genius or something?" Ethan's cheeks flushed again, and he shook his head quickly. "No, I just like math," he said, his voice barely audible. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Mrs. Harding called out, "Ethan, could you stay for a moment?" The class began to file out, but not before several more students stopped to pat Ethan on the back or offer a quick, "That was awesome, man." As they passed, Ethan nodded awkwardly, clutching his notebook tighter, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of attention. The boy who had once longed to be invisible now found himself the center of it all. Once the room had emptied, Mrs. Harding leaned against her desk, studying Ethan with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "Ethan," she began, her tone softer than it had been earlier, "I owe you an apology." Ethan blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "An apology?" She nodded. "I've been teaching for a long time, and I pride myself on knowing my students, on understanding their strengths and weaknesses. But with you," she paused, carefully choosing her words, "I misjudged you. I assumed your quietness meant disinterest. I interpreted your lack of participation as a sign of apathy. Clearly, I was wrong." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. "It's okay," he mumbled, trying to downplay the significance of her words. "No, Ethan, it's not okay," Mrs. Harding said firmly, her eyes conveying a sense of genuine remorse. "You possess a remarkable gift, and I was blind to it for far too long. I don't want to see you hide it, to bury it beneath a cloak of quietness. Do you realize how rare it is for someone your age to solve a problem like that? To think with such clarity and precision?" Ethan looked down at his notebook, his fingers tracing the edges of the worn cover. "I don't know," he said quietly, still struggling to grasp the magnitude of what had just transpired. I just like doing it. It makes sense to me." Mrs. Harding's expression softened even further. "That's precisely what makes it so special, Ethan. You see things differently. You approach problems from a unique perspective, and that's something to be celebrated, not hidden. But here's the thing, you can't keep it all to yourself. There are advanced programs, competitions, even entire career paths that could challenge you, nurture your talent, and allow you to make a real difference in the world, and I want to help you find them." Ethan's heart raced, the possibilities swirling in his mind like a complex equation begging to be solved. The idea of stepping into a world beyond the quiet comfort of his solitary learning was both thrilling and terrifying. He thought back to the moment at the whiteboard, the way the equation had clicked into place, the way the room had felt afterward, charged with energy and admiration. Could he do more? Could he be more? I don't know, he admitted, his voice filled with uncertainty. What if I mess up? What if I'm not as good as everyone thinks I am? Mrs. Harding smiled, a warm, encouraging smile that erased any lingering doubts. Messing up is an inevitable part of learning, Ethan. It's how we grow, how we refine our skills, how we discover our true potential. But if you don't try, if you don't take that leap of faith, you'll never know what you're truly capable of achieving. That night, Ethan sat at the small kitchen table in his family's modest home, his notebook open in front of him, illuminated by the soft glow of the overhead light. His parents sat nearby, listening intently as he recounted the events of the day, the equation, the applause, Mrs. Harding's apology, her offer of support. His mother's eyes glistened with pride as she reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Ethan, sweetheart, we've always known you were special. You have a gift, a unique way of seeing the world. I'm so glad that other people are finally starting to recognize it too. His father nodded, his deep voice steady and reassuring. This is just the beginning, son. Don't be afraid to step out of your comfort zone, to embrace new challenges, to show the world what you can do. We'll be there to support you every step of the way. Ethan spent the rest of the evening staring at the blank page of his notebook. For so long, it had been a repository for his private thoughts, a sanctuary for the problems he solved for himself, the ideas he never shared. But now, it felt like something more. A gateway to a new world. A canvas for his dreams. A testament to his untapped potential. He picked up his pencil and began to write, not just equations and formulas, but ideas, goals, aspirations. For the first time in a long time, Ethan wasn't afraid of being seen, of being judged. He was ready to step forward, to embrace the unknown, to discover where his talent could take him. The next day, the atmosphere in room 204 had shifted. Ethan Bell, the quiet kid who used to blend into the background, now found himself the center of positive attention. As he walked into the classroom, his classmates greeted him with nods, smiles, and even a few tentative high fives. "Yo, Ethan!" a boy called out from the back of the room. "That was crazy yesterday. How'd you even do that?" Ethan hesitated, his usual instinct to shrink from attention warring with a newfound sense of confidence. I just worked through it," he said modestly, sliding into his usual seat by the window. "That wasn't just working through it," another girl chimed in, leaning across her desk. "You made it look easy. You're like a math wizard or something." Ethan's cheeks flushed again, but this time his smile was genuine. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice soft but sincere. Even students who had never spoken to him before now seemed curious about him, wanting to understand the source of his newfound brilliance. A few asked if he could help them with their homework, while others simply wanted to know more about his interests, his passions, and his unique way of seeing the world. For the first time, Ethan felt like he truly belonged, like he was an integral part of the fabric of the class. Mrs. Harding entered the room, her usual brisk energy tempered by a warm, encouraging smile as she glanced towards Ethan. She began the lesson as usual, explaining the day's topic with clarity and precision. But her tone was less sharp, her movements less rigid. When she called on Ethan to answer a question during the lesson, her voice was encouraging rather than critical, conveying a sense of genuine respect for his abilities. Ethan hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts, but then he answered confidently, his explanation clear, concise, and insightful. The class murmured in quiet awe, and Mrs. Harding nodded with satisfaction. "Excellent, Ethan," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "That's the kind of critical thinking we need to see more of in this class." After class, Mrs. Harding asked Ethan to stay behind once more. But this time, the conversation wasn't about apologies or regrets. It was about opportunities and possibilities. "Ethan," she began, sitting on the edge of her desk, "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation yesterday. You have an incredible gift, and I'm determined to help you nurture it. I've already looked into some advanced programs, and I think I've found one that would be a perfect fit for you." Ethan looked down at his notebook, unsure of what to say. "I don't really know what to do with it," he admitted, his voice filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "That's where I can help," Mrs. Harding said, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "There's an advanced math program at the district level designed specifically for students like you who need more of a challenge. It meets after school twice a week, and I think you'd thrive in that environment. You'd be surrounded by like-minded peers, taught by experienced instructors, and exposed to concepts that would truly push you to your limits. Ethan's eyes widened, the possibilities swirling in his mind. The idea of joining an advanced class was both exciting and intimidating. Do you really think I'd be good enough for that?" he asked, his voice tinged with self-doubt. Mrs. Harding smiled, a confident, reassuring smile that banished any lingering uncertainties. "Ethan, I don't think you're good enough. I know you are. You've already proven it. This is a chance for you to explore your potential, to push yourself beyond your comfort zone, to see just how far you can go. I've already spoken to the program coordinator, and they're eager to have you join. What do you say? Are you ready to take the next step?" Ethan's mind raced, weighing the pros and cons, the risks and rewards. He thought about the problem on the whiteboard, the way the class had looked at him with admiration, the pride in his parents' eyes when he told them what had happened. Slowly, tentatively, he nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice filled with a newfound determination. "I'll do it." In the weeks that followed, Ethan blossomed, both academically and personally. He excelled in the advanced math program, thriving in the challenging environment and forming close bonds with his fellow students. Back at Oak Haven Middle School, his reputation as the math kid continued to grow, and his classmates began to seek him out for help, not just with their homework, but as a mentor, a role model, and a friend. One evening, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table, engrossed in a particularly tricky problem for his advanced class, his mother walked in and placed a loving hand on his shoulder. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You've always been special, but now the world is finally starting to see it too." Ethan looked up at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Mom," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Turning back to his notebook, he paused for a moment, his pencil hovering over the page. For so long, his mathematical pursuits had been a solitary escape, a way to find order and meaning in a chaotic world. But now, they had become something more, a bridge to new opportunities, a source of connection, and a pathway to a future he had never dared to imagine. As he wrote the next line of his solution, Ethan felt a quiet certainty settle over him. He didn't know exactly where his path would lead, what challenges he would face, or what triumphs he would achieve. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid to follow it. He was ready to embrace the unknown, to unleash his potential, and to shine brightly in the world. What hidden talents are you afraid to unleash? What small step can you take today to share your gifts with the world? How can you learn from the Ethan's journey and inspire people with autism? I hope this story has inspired you to embrace your unique strengths and pursue your dreams with confidence. Remember, you are capable of amazing things. Wishing you health, joy, and endless inspiration on your journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more inspiring tales of resilience, self-discovery, and the power of human potential, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss out on future content.